a certain continent, because all the time people are trying to sort of from Google search or like the general sort of like how people are associate identity with Europe, identity with Africa, identity with Asia, identity with North and South America, and so on. There's always going to be some sort of bias or some kind of stereotype that you're going to associate with them. So, depiction of identity within Europe, within Africa. You can also do Google image search of Asia, or like Asia people, and you'll have the stereotype behind it. So Africa is not actually unique to how it's being presented. It's true that we do not have as much visibility as other countries in terms of our technological advancements, our fine art advancements, and so on. Then I actually did the same thing for Nairobi. Now, interestingly enough, the photographs that that you see. Sorry, I'm just gonna have to do this. No, I'll just walk around. So interestingly enough, what you see in terms of photographs about Nairobi are actually Nairobi and Nairobi people are actually all images from the Westgate attacks. 2 years back, and so a year back, 2 years back, a year back, 2 years back, 2 years back. So what you see is actually a friend of mine there, Elaine, is also there. She's Chinese. She's actually Vietnamese, but American-born. And then obviously then you have, so it's like this weird sort of like interdispersed sort of like tribal photos with the photographs of the Westgate attacks, which actually I found very interesting. That kind of sort of perception about like Nairobi and terror and what had happened before then, how people are kind of coping with this identity, and how people are kind of coping with Nairobi being the city that is, going to be always subject to terror attacks because of our relation with Somalia. Then I Googled Kenya and art. So Kenya and art, and Kenya, more specifically Kenya and fine art. And the images that you see from that are exactly what you would think is going to come up from Kenya and fine art. It's all the Maasai holding the spear with the red sunset in the background, and the acacia tree, maybe a hippo. No, not a hippo. Yeah. So one of the images that I actually saw that was very interesting. So there's always going to be like masks and all this kind of stuff, which actually Kenya is actually not known for actually having masks within their tribes. And masks is a very sort of now become this sort of Pan-African identity that we're all going to be looking at, and sort of like when people think about how do we make it African, like if you think about the South to Soul cover, like how do we actually make this African? It's actually just sort of adorning themselves with all these artifacts, these things that sort of represent an archaic version of our continent, archaic version of our country as well. But what was very interesting for me is that there's actually a photograph by a famous photographer, Peter Beard. Now, Peter Beard was a photographer that lived in Kenya and sort of lived out this fantasy, this sort of colonial fantasy of Africa, and went out and photographed, naked women in the wild with the acacia trees and blah blah blah. And he sort of made this into this these journals and sold it predominantly in the U.S. as fine art, representing our country as this sort of colonial fantasy. And like when you look at African photography, more specific Kenyan photography, Peter Beard is somebody who's going to come up in history that has represented our country. Not somebody who is actually Kenyan, but somebody who's from the US, depicting what he wanted to see in the country. Now, coming off of the back of that, and knowing the photographers that I know, and knowing what happens in Kenya with photography, and looking back at when you Google art and fine art in Kenya with the Maasai and the spear, what's an image that is very often photographed, even by contemporary photographers today, is the Maasai with backdrop and front lighting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a very common depiction of our country by contemporary photographers. This is Neil Thomas, who is white Kenyan? I don't know where he's from. But Neil Thomas is very famous for doing these large prints and also doing advertising campaigns for Safaricom. Here we go. Can you guys see this? Yeah? It's kind of weird doing it from the computer. There you go. So this is actually done not by a Kenyan photographer, but actually a photographer that I know in New York called Joey Lawrence. Yeah. Joey Lawrence has a certain style of photography and a certain sort of way of photographing people, which kind of is emulated in Mutua Matheka's photos and kind of emulated in Neil Thomas's photo. And also, this is another photographer here that's very contemporary, sort of seen as a new photographer that uses Photoshop to sort of advance the imagery in a certain way, but still kind of going back to this depiction of Kenya and this depiction of us, which is the sort of tribal wear, the light in the front, the background being sort of very rural. Same thing. So the question is, as photographers and as artists, in terms of depicting our country and who we are, what are we concentrating on in like releasing things into the media as to what people should be looking at in terms of our in our continent, and sorry, more specifically, Kenya, Nairobi. This is Peter Beard himself, so just so you can have a better understanding of Peter Beard's post process is actually super interesting, which is actually why I feel that he got quite a lot of attention. Yay! Is this working for you guys? Is this alright? Yeah? You really get the backlight through the laptop. So this is this kind of colonial journal is what Peter Beard decided to concentrate on. So as a contemporary photographer, as a contemporary artist that is opening up a discussion and willing to create imagery that you want to put out into the world, what is more important to you? How you want to be represented by yourself, or how do you want other people to think you should be represented, or how other people think the country should be represented? If I can already Google Africa and get images of people wearing, tribal wear and, with this amazing lighting, blah, 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 I mean, we'll always have that. It will always be part of our history. It is not that it is not important. It is still an important part of our identity as Kenyans, but it's not the only part of our identity. And as contemporary photographers and people who want to be part of the fine art discourse, we shouldn't sort of go ahead and think that because people want to look at our country in this way, we need to create images in this way so that they can sell or so that they can think it's acceptable. Or what you want to do is push forward this conversation. Pushing forward. Now, there are a lot of photographers on this scene. If you guys were paying attention to what happened at the Lagos Photo Festival and different photo festivals around the world and the Making Africa exhibits and so on, there are a lot of photographers that are there that are part of the conversation that is sort of showing Africa in a different light. However, there are still tropes that African photographers like to use to perpetuate this image of us. And that can be sort of really simply sort of distilled down to fabrics. How our fabrics represent us and who we are in terms of why we wear these fabrics or where these fabrics are from. And it's common to see these fabrics. It's true. This is in our day-to-day life. You see a lot of people wearing fabrics. You just one. Just like one person wearing this. I mean, that's actually a valid point. Out of this sample of people, there's only one person wearing this fabric. And this is not something that we have on the day-to-day. Let's go. So fabric is one of the tropes that's used, one of the symbols that's used to sort of represent this idea of Africana, masks, body paint, beading. So this is actually a very famous photographer who is currently sort of working very closely with a lot of like major photo gallery people and museums and so on. Her name is Joanna Chomali. And Joanna Chomali is her most popular and most famous series is about scarification and the death of scarification and how scarification is now something that is sort of dying out and not as many people are using scarification as adornment. So it was more about this conversation is, yes, I am talking about these archaic old methods of adornment and so on, but I'm more talking about the death of these and showing the beauty of them, but then also showing the fact that this is going to be the last set of images that you're going to see of people with scarification. Okay, so now looking at Joanna Chomali's work, and she's also a fellow winner of the Contemporary African Photography Awards. I decided to look at another friend of mine who's also a stunning photographer, an amazing photographer, and very, very smart woman. And you'll notice I am actually choosing a lot of female photographers for this talk because a lot of the time photography is sort of overrun with men. So I'm trying to also sort of make sure that we have a discussion about women representing Africa and so on. So her photo project, Ya Kala Ben, by Namsa Lueba, which is this. This is her photo project. This is one of the images. I'll show you another image in a minute. So you can see from the image that it does have this kind of like Africanness and this sort of like use of the body paint, the fabrics, the spears and so on. But actually what she has done is something completely against, now forgive me, but I've actually forgotten which country she had made this in. I think it was somewhere in Cote d'Ivoire. Somewhere like close to there. So she actually had a really tough time photographing this project because what she was doing is using the symbols and the things that is native to the people in Cote d'Ivoire, let's say, and rejigging it, changing it in a way that is unpleasant or a way that they think is incorrect. Which is a very interesting way of looking at tribal work, or some things around tribal work, is sort of configuring these symbols that they sort of hold dear to themselves, sort of like taking away the symbolism behind it and adding her own definition, her own meaning, instead of using the masks as the masks itself as the purpose of the mask. She's now repurposing the masks, so repurposing these fabrics to redefine what tribal identity is. This is another one of hers as well. So this is another sort of thing. So she uses materials and she uses landscapes, but she uses it in a very sort of contemporary photographic manner in terms of color blocking. How she's done the color blocking, what are the sort of contemporary sort of aesthetic use of aesthetics behind photography. So now how? So she sort of reconfigured these tropes to create a different discussion around it. But there's still this clinging, this identity that we are clinging onto. And where does that come from and why do we want to do it? Both of the photographers are actually from Africa, grew up in Africa. Joanna Chomali grew up, not Joanna, Namsa also grew up in Switzerland as well. But they're both trying to find their identity through these tribal tropes and these things that you see very often. Then another part of contemporary photography, another thing that we see very often is the other. How does the other look at us in terms of photography? And more interesting, how does a Belgian person look at the Congo? And that's a very interesting discussion. And this is actually a really, really nice guy. I don't really like his work all that much, but he's a very interesting person to show in terms of contemporary photography and representing the Congo and representing sort of these tribal Africana images. And it's Patrick Bullock. So Patrick sort of has these very, 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 very elaborate setups, going above and beyond just, this idea of documentation, of just this idea of, like, hey, stand on this hill, let me photograph you. He's actually worked with the tribespeople and the people who live in the Congo to create these very, very elaborate setups and uses the sun to do so. And even though the image isn't all that stunning, I mean, it is stunning. I mean, his images are, very beautiful. They look very photoshopped, but they're actually not. Even though it is like this, and that it kind of represents this idea of Africana that I don't particularly agree on, the process of doing this is very interesting. The way of them getting that photograph is interesting. The way of communicating with the tribe and discussing them how he can represent the tribe and what they want to do with this, within the Congo to create this. But then it's also very interesting the fact that a Belgian man in the Congo kind of working to represent the country in a different way, even though, excuse my French, the Belgians really fucked up that country, like properly, So in the Congo, there's so much work coming out of photography work coming out of the Congo, but mostly done by white photographers in this sort of documentary manner. And they have this sort of idea of making it compelling, their understanding of being an other and being the other on looking onto the continent and creating something. Omar Victor Diop. Guys, can you see this? I mean, you don't really need to see this that closely, but it's very understood what he's doing. So Omar Victor Diop as well, a lot to do with setup, a lot to do with sort of creating and setting up a photo to sort of perpetuate this idea of creativity and fabric, and his diaspora project where he sort of looks at the new identity and combining the new identity of old portraits of African people in sort of the oil painting era, before like photography, before anything, sort of, and recreating that with himself. So now this is kind of his project is now yes about the photo, but also very performative. What is this performance of adorning this outward wear to represent my culture, to represent the people that came before me, to represent these portraits of prominent African people in history. So yeah, so we've touched on a few bits and pieces about photography. Are there any questions?
Yeah. So you show a lot of photos which are like glamorizing the culture. Like a lot of these photographers that you've touched on have have the prints, they've got the patterns and all that going on. And there's also that similar trend over here. They're like glamorizing, it's kind of like saying, yes, we embrace this part of our culture, and this is something we want to bring into, what we want to say about Kenya and what we want to say about Africa. But then you've also said that this is not the only thing about us.
Yeah, exactly. Just to sort of recap what we've spoken about in terms of the photographers that we've looked at so far. It's specifically in African photography. We've looked at the traditional view, and the modernization of sort of traditional paintings into something that is seen in photography. We've seen appropriation, we've seen redefinition, and with Omar Victor we've seen performance as well. but all of them surrounded with these tropes of what makes them African. These ideas of things that they sort of grab on by looking around them, or what Europe tells us we're like, or what America tells us we're like, or we tell ourselves what we should be like. You know what I mean? I mean, you were dressed up like you should be in Brooklyn, to be honest, like with the flannel or whatever. But but you identify as being Kenyan, right? You identify being as Nairobi in the modern sort of location. So performance now in photography is something that has become kind of not really a trend, but now understanding photography as a performance, and the interaction between the photographer, the camera, and then the subject and the camera and the photographer, and performing the photograph, and creating this idea, because now with performance you can now create different situations and scenarios and stuff that's fictitious and so on. So Christina Demidel, very, very famous. She just curated the Lagos Photo Festival. Very, very famous photographer. Did this photo series called Afronauts. Afronauts. I think they're making a movie at some time. They did, right? Was it good?
Was it related to the...
No.
Yeah.
Wasn't related to the work. So, Christina, is the next one? So Christina Demidel made this photo series and had this idea about Africa having, was it in Zambia, right?
Yeah.
Having the Space Aeronautical Research Center and sending, African people to whatever to sort of perform this fictitious narrative about these people in different, landscapes and whatever. And Africa actually, as a continent, is just perfect for alien landscapes. I mean, there's so like you can go up to, like freaking Ethiopia to the Danakil Depression, and it looks like the surface of Mars. Or you can go right up to the Simeon Mountains, and it looks like something else. There are so many things within Africa that is so unexplored nature-wise that you can actually make these fictitious narratives, which is interesting. But again, she's, in terms of the tropes that she's using to represent African people, there is this, the grass, these grass skirts kind of hanging off the limbs, the fabrics, and all of this kind of stuff. It's like, this is what is kind of still a trend. It's kind of like, okay, we're talking about the future, but we still have these things here. And also like just the entrance of these fabrics into our cultures as well. It's not really entirely an intrinsic process that came from African people themselves. It's something that has been exported onto the country and adopted by, our tastes in color and in fabric. Then we have a good friend of Jackie. Jackie's a very good friend, Jan Hook. You remember him? He did a very interesting photo project in Tanzania, where he asked Maasai people, how do you want to be photographed? And they all came up with 3 ideas of how they want to be photographed. And these are just 2 photographs, that I just thought that was very interesting. So these are all Maasai people with their own ideas of how they want to be photographed. And he's Dutch. He's Dutch. So, like in terms of like the outside, I'm right now talking about the outside looking in. So Jan Hook, Christina Demidel, Patrick Willock are all white people from Europe looking in. So this was a very interesting photo project from Jen. Just seeing them as photographs themselves are impressive in a way that the lighting is very contemporary and how the photographs are taken are very contemporary, and they actually are on trend with what is going on. If you go to like MFA photo and you talk to people who are doing contemporary photography, this is the current look that it's going. So he's actually giving them photographs that within the fine art discourse, within photography, this is what is very contemporary. And it's actually a really nice thing to see. But at the same time, him being the other allows people to make this comment about another form of colonialism, another way of taking advantage of people, another way of saying, why are Africans not making these discussions themselves? And so Aperture magazine, this one, I forget his name now, this one guy made this whole long discussion about Africa and photography and how Jan Hook, Christina Demidel, and now Vivian Sasson, which I'll show you Vivian Sasson, who is actually my most favorite ever photographer. I absolutely love her work.
Why do you like her work?
I'll show you in a minute. You see. Yeah, so this is Vivian Sasson. Yeah. Do you guys have any idea where these photographs were taken?
Senegal. Senegal?
No.
Christina.
No. Nairobi and Arusha.
What?
Yeah.
No.
Vivian Sasson did all her projects out of Nairobi, Arusha, but this one no. I think this was done in Malindi or somewhere. Or the Tanzanian coast. Vivian Sasson worked. A lot of her work was out of East Africa, out of Kenya, and her work, we don't even see it, which is another issue because, this is the photo project, how she creates her photographs with the lines and the color blocking and how it's done, and the use of the shadow, and something that is so unique about Nairobi and so unique about photographing in Kenya and in this area is that the sun is constantly above us. And it's this thing where in Europe and in other places where the sun is always kind of to the side, you always have this side lighting. But with the sun sort of like directly above us for a majority part of the day, taking photographs, with that sort of like side lighting is only left for 2 or 3 hours in the morning or 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. What I like her is that she actually used this direct sunlight that goes straight down onto everything and just makes these ghastly shadows. For a lot of photographers find that very irritating to work with. But she used her sort of skill as both a fashion photographer and a fine art photographer to make compositions that actually make compelling photographs, that actually you want to print them and look at them and then not have to sort of like associate with this. You're not looking at the photograph for just, oh, this is Africa and like this is somebody wearing this and this and this. You're actually looking at this photograph, which is like, this is a very compelling image whereby you have people interacting and the lighting is beautiful and this is interesting and you have this color blocking. So it's more a discussion about the photograph rather than just like, oh, these are just people who wear like tribal wear. So her and Christina Demidel and Jan Hook were looked on by a writer for the Aperture magazine as people that eroticize Africa in a major way. Jan Hook replied to this article saying that, this is really, really unfair, where a lot of the photography that you see coming out from Africa, Kenya themselves, like Africa, Nairobi, Kenya themselves, is sort of the perpetuated image of what Africa should be.
You said something interesting about lighting, right? You said our light here, the majority of the time is coming from above.
Yeah.
And then it seems like some people want to correct that as opposed to using it to their advantage.
Yeah.
Is there something that can be said to that? And maybe
it's because when we look at photographs, and we look at these, when we look at photographs from sort of the global north, and when we look at people who are trained in photography in the global north, and where the discussion of photography comes from, a lot of the lighting techniques and everything that you see emulates this idea of like the like it's from paintings, from things that you've seen before in European artwork. You go to Lamu and you go inside sort of like one of those things. You're not going to get a nice, beautiful directional lighting because the thing is, the place is so narrow. And you go into one of those rooms, it's dark. So like you're not going to get these like amazing sort of like chiaroscuro lighting that looks like something that was painted by Caravaggio or one of the sort of great Baroque painters or Renaissance painters at all. You're just going to have this very sort of direct lighting. And when you have this direct lighting, how you use it compositionally is like very, very important. But if you look at, now 50 years ago and all this kind of stuff with Tinga art and art that came from here, everything was very flat. Because like when we look at stuff through a lens and we just look at stuff through our eyes and stuff like that, with this directional light, this light coming from above, it makes everything flat. So that's why actually a lot of Kenyan sort of like 2D artists have very flat work compared to stuff that has the shadows and this sort of dimensionality to it. And what I like about Vivian Sasson is that she's actually used this to an advantage and created her own aesthetic behind it, instead of running away from something that, that can be repaired. And one of the things that I like is that how she approaches like skin color, like so more often than not, everyone sort of is complaining about like, oh, like you need a lot of lighting to photograph people who are like darker skinned people, and you need this lighting, this lighting, this lighting. You don't really need to expose the entire person's face. You can actually look at the composition of the photo and use the darkness to an advantage instead of looking at it as something that is a hindrance to creating the photograph. Like the skin texture of of darker toned people, how the light reflects, how it's lit is so different to how you light somebody who's white. So that's another thing that I really like about her, is that she's actually used this sort of advantage. And when you look at the image, you actually see the skin as this, something that you really want to touch, instead of somebody who's just been blown out with light and then retouched completely, and then now the in looking out and the in representing us. Good friend of mine, probably a good friend of a lot of you guys. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this. Have you guys never seen this before? Jim Choo Choo.
That's it.
Yeah. Jim Choo Choo. Jim Choo Choo is amazing. I really love Jim Choo Choo's work. He's a very good friend of mine as well.
It's all visual.
Yeah, he's very visual. So Jim kind of like is the one with Just a Band, like very familiar with Just a Band, and like his whole movements and him as an artist when he was creating pop music and pop culture and all of this kind of thing, all this kind of stuff, was things that were veering away from what the stereotypical view of Africa was. What instruments are being used, how the instruments are being used, and so on. And in this photo series, which I find very beautiful, Pagans, he kind of depicts this sort of like otherworldliness, this fantasy world that Jim is so well known for, creating this fantasy, creating something so different. And people in Europe, like looking into this work doesn't look like it's intrinsically African, it's coming from Africa, that has like the pattern and so on. So I find that just very interesting as part of the photo discourse within the fine art world. Another great photographer, also a fine art photographer, editorial photographer. Welcome. So you guys are probably looking at these images and you're saying like, okay, so what's so special about these images, right? You're like, what is this image about? So, this is a very, he's actually LA-based photographer, Zed Nelson, So Zed Nelson is a photographer that really kind of focuses on socioeconomic issues and just social issues in general. So one of his very famous photo series was about plastic surgery. And he photographed people in LA who've had plastic surgery within their houses in this environment. So with his work, you have to really look back and see what is the dialogue between, what is this conversation that he's creating from the beginning? So the environment, the person, the place, where it is, how people are doing it. His images are very complex in the way that it is a lot to do with symbolism. This particular project is actually about the divide between white and black people in South Africa and how people build walls with these cameras looking out, to get, like richer white people keeping the other out. This man, powerful white businessman in the front with, black man in the back. So it's all about this kind of conversation, this symbolism. So photographs don't need to have this hyperized, aesthetic to actually make sense. You can photograph something to create a book. You don't have to photograph something to always make a tableau. You can photograph something to make a portfolio book or something along the lines of like a zine or something physical that you can actually look at that creates a conversation. And this is a very interesting photo series. Is there another one? Yeah. This, them, and the other. So whenever you actually create a photograph, or you want to put a photograph up for public view, it's always going to be people always are going to be allowed to discuss it from a critical manner, And a lot of the ways that I can actually sit down and look at photographs that other people have put on a wall and whatever, and critically take it apart to actually make a conversation about it that wasn't the photographer's intention, but the photographer should be aware about. And especially as a fine artist, that you need to be understanding of the intention that you're trying to sort of convey or put up or have an interpretation of. What are the symbols in the photograph? Is there a city in the background? Is a man removed from the front from the city? Is he looking at the camera? Is he looking away from the camera? How is he interacting with the subject? How is the subject interacting with the camera, with the person looking at them, and so on? So all of this within photography is very different from painting or tableaus or anything like this because of the performance of photography and the idea of documentary.
It makes it seem that you have to set up the photograph, the person. You can't. It's not just taking a picture or something.
But then,
or a moment. By the time you process all of that.
But then always you have to go back to the great Cartier-Bresson, who said the decisive moment. There's always the decisive moment that you will have from the camera that will capture and encapsulate the entire situation. So that moment is what you're actually recording. That decisive moment. There are things that just driving on this down Nairobi that you can capture that will really make a very powerful discussion, using the buildings, using the construction, using the police officers, using all of these things. And what I find very, very irritating about photography coming out of Nairobi is that people are so quick to kind of cut out things like billboards and bits and pieces that make Safaricom ads or people wearing t-shirts with logos all over them or whatever. It's people really want to cut that out because that's not the perception that they want to have in the photograph because that's what they don't think is aesthetic, but that this is part of the conversation of what you're looking at. What does this mean that somebody's wearing a Safaricom ad but everyone, I was in Lamu, I was photographing the Lamu boat festival, not festival, the races. And the first thing that you really want is coloring and then just whatever, blah, blah, blah. But then take a moment to really look around you. There are all of these boats and all of these Swahili people on these boats chasing these guys with iPads and mobile phones, and that's so interesting in itself. Sometimes the meta of something is more interesting than the object itself. I say this a lot. But you don't want to always have to look at things from such a narrow vista, that you also want to take time to step back and see what is the conversation of the onlooker onto the object, and what is it, what are these conversations? Like, don't cut things out from the picture just because you think it's ugly.
Do you think it could be something to do with the tool they're using at the moment? Because you mentioned Bresson, and if you take his quote, I remember he said something about when you're using film, you actually don't take what you're seeing, you anticipate it.
Yeah.
As opposed to digital photography, you actually have a moment to peep into what you're seeing, and then the fact that you have Photoshop to manipulate it, and you're able to crop as opposed to film, for instance. Do you think it could be something to do with the tool you're using that allows people to cut?
There's very, honestly, I studied digital photography and film. There's very little difference other than now with the ability to take more images in the camera, because you have memory cards and those can be as large as you want, because you're always stuck with a certain amount. And so with film, people have to pick and choose how they take these photographs. You can always crop with film. Actually, film has a better resolution than digital. But for some, and that was in a time where you really had to kind of like wait for things to happen. And it's true, you do have to wait for things to happen, but it's capturing that decisive moment that makes sense. And whether, you're with your phone, whether you're with a 2 megapixel camera, whether you're with a 26 megapixels, 42 megapixel camera, it doesn't matter the quality of the camera. What matters is the brain that's using that camera. You can have the best camera in the world and take the shittest images in the world, and I've seen it, and we look at these adverts every day, So, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, when it comes to, a lot of people like, oh, film is like this, and digital is like this, and one of the things. But what I find so interesting about digital is that the only way that we can make digital physical is out of something so archaic as ink. You know what I mean? That's kind of like an interesting thing. Because if you have a photograph on your computer, how are you going to put it onto a piece of paper?
True. I don't know. I think you didn't
fully answer your question.
I think let's think of black and white and dark room.
Yeah.
I've taken this room.
Yeah.
And, for me to get in the dark room, there's no cutting. I'll actually have the whole frame that I took is going to come up in my photograph.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I take myself and now shoot here, and Instagram immediately allows me to crop or whatever. There's a crop thing.
Yeah.
The delete button is another story for another day, where you take and you don't have time to look at your photo because you can take another one, you preview very quickly, delete.
Yeah.
You take it and you decide, I don't want Tahir in the frame and I can crop. Is it that ability, that tool, is it what is making this possible? Everybody, I know a handful of photographers, and I know a lot of people who think or who believe a photo is not complete without Photoshop. Is it the tool that enables you to do this?
So basically, if you think about Photoshop does all of the things that allows you to do in darkroom.
That is very true. I don't refuse, but what you don't get is it's instantly available. Does that play a part in how people manipulate photos?
I mean, now like how we can take a photo and publish it and for people to see it, that's kind of like a different discussion from how we can manipulate them, I feel. Now with photographs, more people than before have phones that can take photographs, right? Before with film, not that many people were taking photographs with film. And photographs were always seen as something that you have to know a lot about lighting, a lot about this, blah, blah, blah. And so with the phone and with most cameras, everything is now automated. So the difficulty behind taking photographs is now automated, and you can crop and you can do everything from one device. Whereby film was a slower process where You can take photographs. So if I was to take a photograph from Jackie, but I can still actually crop out with film, because film you sort of project from the top and then you have it onto the photosensitive paper. So what you do is you can just put black bars and stuff and then expose it onto the paper.
It's not about what you can do on film versus what you cannot do on digital and vice versa. It's the moment, or how can I put it? The convenience of when you can do it and how fast you can do it. Do you think that influences you use the word cutting?
Yeah.
Do you think that influences why people cut without stepping back and looking at the phone?
Oh yeah. I mean, firstly, these days, why do people take photographs on their phone? And why? Why do you take photographs on your phone? To record your life, because it has a camera. You put it on Instagram. I follow you on Instagram. You record your life. You're recording. You're communicating. You're adding to a conversation. Blah blah blah. Before, with film, this wasn't something that would happen very quickly. And how you decide to crop and put things together, it's all about you as a photographer, it's your personality, how you want to be perceived by others. With Instagram and with editing and with all of this kind of stuff, the photos that you put out onto these social media platforms is how you want yourself to be seen. It's not the truth.
What about one of the photographers who've shown us? It's all about social media. For me, it's about the cutting bit. You say that you say something that is after 10 people cut what would have been important. Is it because they have scissors?
I think it's because I think a lot of people cut out stuff from the photo and from photos of Nairobi and photos of Kenya and like you want to take a photograph of like a giraffe, but you don't want to take a photograph of the giraffe with a tourist van in the background. Right? So, but I think it's more interesting to see, the giraffe with the tourist.
I think that's where I was going. It depends on who's taking the photo. If
Exactly.
it's an outsider looking in or insider looking in.
Yeah.
Because probably as a Kenyan, the giraffe would not be interested in the photo and crop it and remain with the building.
Yeah, which I think is far more interesting than looking at more wildlife photography. I just don't know what are you going to do with all of this wildlife photography?
Long story for us.
So the question behind this song.
It's not really a question, it's just a sentiment.
Yeah.
And this is my opinion, and this is from what me and my friends have observed.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why we Nairobians really cut stuff from photos is because the perception of the Western media, how it looks at African countries and how we want to show Africa to the world is completely different. And we feel like we have to show the beauty of it, and we have to cut out the negatives for the world to accept us.
That's an interesting point, but it's also a really sad thing that you have to say that.
Yes.
In general.
Absolutely. But that's the truth, that's what's happening, that's what's all over Instagram, everywhere.
Yeah, the hashtag This Is Africa or like Day in Africa and all of this kind of stuff, which is also,
Kenya 365.
Yeah,
But I think there's also a different side to it. It's sort of the side that I really like, where someone who obviously grew up in the suburbs and has an accent feels like they have to go to Kibera and like take beauty shots of the place because that's what's contemporary.
That's what people find interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, Mutua did a very good job, kind of like showing Nairobi in the beginning as this sort of metropolitan with the lights and the HDR photography and all that kind of stuff. That was a really important part of Nairobi in photography then, kind of like how we're representing the city and making these beautiful images of the city. But now, I'm now more kind of discussing that is something that needed to be done. But now that that's done, we need to push the medium of photography. We need to depict things that make a more compelling argument about our country, not necessarily it having to be positive, not necessarily it having to be negative, but then a compelling argument in photography that's not necessarily to do with our country, but then photography on a whole internationally, right? We don't need to make photographs specifically just because we're in Kenya, about Kenya, for Kenyans, for this thing. We need to make photography about sort of replying to the entire discourse, and the whole idea is educating yourself about this discourse and educating yourself what's going on in fine art photography and what the rest of the world is looking at, so that when we actually do come to do the Nairobi Photo Festival in 2 years, that there is actually going to be photographs that are going to match what other photographers around the world are saying. Because we're not like, you know, Kenya, Nairobi, we're a very educated sort of set of people in East Africa. So it doesn't mean that we always have to sort of fall prey to this celebritizing or like the popularity of Instagram photographs. You know what I mean? It doesn't really matter how many people follow you on Instagram, as long as you're kind of making a discussion and like creating photographs that are compelling and interesting that you feel comfortable about. Because like once you start removing the idea of the other and this idea of being like commercially viable and all of this kind of stuff, then what else would you photograph? If the consumer was not in mind, what would you photograph? Right? Yeah.
I do a lot of landscapes and documentary work.
What's your name?
My name is Solomon.
Solomon.
My brand name is Roots of Africa.
Roots of Africa. Okay, I haven't seen that.
Okay, so with film,
Yeah.
you shoot less, alright?
With what?
With film. Yeah, no, I mean the whole film.
Yeah.
You get to shoot a few photographs, right?
Like 24, 12.
Yeah, but with digital you shoot a lot. So the thing is, now we are not that we're in the digital age yet. I've had an instance where me and my friends, him being one of them, going to a location and the landscape is so mind-blowing, and we find that we don't care about the light and compositions, and sometimes we shoot a lot because of excitement. Do you think maybe if we'd be using a film camera with maybe, you know, pose and compose yourself and, you know, take a good photograph?
I mean, you know, film and digital is a different practice, all in general, entirely. There are different there are many. I know a lot of photographers that use medium format cameras and large format cameras, and they use that for the aesthetic purpose because of the tilting and all this kind of stuff. And if you really want to kind of like look at landscape photography and kind of start from the beginning of landscape photography, I suggest that you start looking at Ansel Adams.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Ansel Adams, but you know, a lot of the time people said that Ansel Adams, this great guy who came up with the steps of gray, and he actually sort of like opened up the idea of the conversation of light and photography and stuff, and he did landscape photography. But if you really look at his photographs, he's actually photographing weather. He's photographing, and I think he was a meteorologist, and he's actually photographing kind of the clouds with the landscape and how that's actually happening. That's kind of the dialogue of the weather and the landscape. Photographing landscape is really hard because a lot of people can do it with my phone, with his phone. What phone do you have? Not with Jackie's phone.
Doesn't take pictures.
Jackie takes pictures, but you see now when you come to landscape photography, and I have a lot of things to say about landscape photography coming out of Kenya, is that what do we look at? I'm not a landscape photographer. I photograph predominantly people, and I do a lot of process, and a lot of work that I do is I can't really sort of like jump into this conversation about like landscape without having practiced it for at least a few years, you know what I mean? But my comment around landscape is that we haven't had this wave of like new topography here in Kenya just as yet, and like people are photographing landscapes that sort of look untouched and very beautiful and all of this kind of stuff. But then the landscape that I'm really interested in right now is like the changing landscape. Like, what are all of these suburbs like kind of looking like? What is Kileleshwa turning into? What are all of these Chinese like buildings kind of making and doing to our landscape in Nairobi, in Kenya, and so on? So this is another sort of avenue to explore. And landscape photography, you know, is a huge subject that you can make a lot of commentary around. because architecture at the end of the day is something that's man-made, and that's kind of open to discussion of how is that this man-made object interacting with the land, interacting with other buildings, and so on. And the very famous landscape photographer and photographer that discusses architecture from Kenya is James Muriuki. So his work is something you need to look at as well. Photographs I like. This is Roger Mellon out of South Africa. And so he does this very crazy kind of like photograph. He works with like the Antwoord and like a bunch of people, and so he photographs people with like, you know, this interesting photographs that I like. Roger Mellon again. Okay, so I guess let's open up to some questions and stuff. So influences. So she asked about influences. What influences me as a photographer? Jackie influences me a lot. Actually, it's true. Jackie does influence me a lot in terms of my work. There are a lot of things that I look at that influence me that are centered around social issues. I'm very interested in social issues, and I'm also very interested in process. So my interests are what influence me. So I'm really interested in gender dynamics. I'm very interested in socioeconomics. I'm also very interested in application of photographs onto mediums, and like how do we get the photograph out of the digital realm into the physical realm, and what is the discussion behind that. So all of these little bits and pieces and nitty-gritty things are what interest me and what I feel that I want to say in photography and stuff. So really, what interests you and like how far you want to push your interest is what's going to open you up in terms of your artwork, your photography, your, you know, dance moves, right? You know, you don't just like dance ballroom, you know, when there's hip hop music playing if you're into hip hop music.
I have a question. You mentioned something about photo festivals. I don't know right now or before we were talking, but now going back to everything we just talked about appropriation, the other looking in.
We talked about
a lot. So now, like, as everybody has noticed, there are a lot of festivals in relation to visual art that are just cropping up in the African continent where everybody just wants to come and make one. But then the thing is, like, a good example is the Addis Photo Fest, which is the biggest and famous of all the photo festivals, where like last year they had, or Aida, who runs the festival, she had like a couple of African photographers coming from the African continent, which is always problematic. But then a lot of them are based in the diaspora. And then we had a lot of these artists coming like from the US and Europe who came to show their work in Addis. But then you look at the work and it has no relation whatsoever to what's happening in contemporary Africa or Ethiopia or whatever. So like now there's this idea to have a photo festival in Nairobi, which now is like Nairobi is where everybody wants to come in. What are your like thoughts about this? Because I think also you're personally.
I will be personally involved.
Can I add also?
Yes.
Because you're doing a lot of contemporary photography, and in Kenya is not.
Well, I mean, everything is contemporary photography.
Yours incorporates a lot of design work, but it's not necessarily fashion. Like this set you did, use the local one, a lot of stuff. Yeah. Most people don't do that anymore. Most of it is high-end fashion. That's what paints here. Very few people do it as a commercial thing.
Yeah.
Most people do it as like personal work.
Yeah.
Osborne's work is like personal job. If he's employed to do something that he's only employed for his life. Right? But his personal work will be stuff almost related to contemporary.
Yeah.
If you have a photo festival,
he's employed for his lighting?
Sorry?
He's employed just for his lighting?
He's employed for his
lighting. So if he's making like money out of it, just buy yourself like a purple gel and then like a blue one and then just tack it on to some lights.
But his concepts, the question is around the concepts.
Yeah.
Because in Kenya most people don't do concepts. And
but then he might tend to disagree with husband particularly.
Let me first question, then
He does not do concepts.
Yeah.
He actually does.
There are concepts like,
Huge. That's not the example.
but then also like it's also like within your discourse, what does concept mean? Is within what does concept mean as well?
If
So,
you have a festival,
yeah.
what would Kenyan photographers have to present?
Yes.
Will it be more documentary? Will it be more conceptual work? Will it be more, or you're going to have a photo festival and have sculptures and designers featuring prominently instead of
No, with photo, I mean, the discussion around photo has sort of like changed a lot. It's not just generally like how like photos. You know, there's also the post process behind photos. You know, like how are these photos kind of made and how they put together and how they printed and what is the process behind it. That's an avenue of photography as well. But then also there's documentary photography, commercial photography, and so on. I think for the Nairobi Photo Festival, there will be a theme behind the festival, and then we will curate photographs and photographers that will follow that theme to create this discussion of what we think should be spoken about with photography in Nairobi. So we have to make like an educated like theme, you know. But this theme, I mean, the Lagos Photo Festival, the theme was just ridiculous. It was about design and design in Africa, and this design, that design, this is blah blah blah, design. Not knowing what design means, and then asking a photographer, Krista Deminel, to curate it, the whole thing. And then none of the actual work is actually to do with design. It's just all of her and Azu's friends who are photographers that are actually up visually there. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of politics behind certain things as well. But I think for the Nairobi Photo Festival, I don't think it'll be very political. I think that there's going to be a lot of how the show is curated and how the whole thing is put together will be with like a team of people and also a competition behind that as well. And the competition can be but with Jackie, with what you're saying with other people, like the other kind of people showing photos in Addis that are not from Addis and are different from the discussion, one of the benefits about having an international photo exhibition is to also bring photographs from outside, so then to kind of instill like to start a different discussion, to show other people what other photographers around the world are doing, not necessarily having it to do it. Because if there's going to be the New York Photo Festival, which there is, but like all the time, if all the photographers are from the States, then you know it's only going to be the discourse around that kind of photography. Then Kenyan photographers and Nigerian photographers and Bali photographers won't really have that much of an opportunity to show if it's all only going to be centered around one thing. But I think the Nairobi Photo Festival, to be honest, is going to be really centered around kind of like just the continent and then things that do the continent, perhaps. Let's see.
To take the photo that you're taking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like, for example, if I have no experience of Kibera, but I decide I'm gonna go and like, this is what people want to see, this is what I'm going to sell. So even though I actually don't have any commentary on it, or I have no experience of it, like Mario Mastinao was born there, so he takes photos, he actually has something to contribute to how that particular slum is being seen. For me, I'm just kind of adding to how I think everyone wants to see it.
Yeah.
Right, so, and like especially with street photography, where it's like stuff is going on in Italy.
Yeah.
Do I then, can I come from like Mombasa and be like, yo, stuff is going on in Italy, and just show up and take photos and not have any kind of discussion?
Like relation with it?
Yeah.
Okay. I can answer your question, actually. So, as as a fine artist or as a documentary photographer or as a commercial photographer or whatever, every photographer is going to have a certain aesthetic, and every photographer is going to have a certain control or idea of what their photographs are going to look like. If your idea is to go to Bira and to emulate photos that are already made, devoid of your own personality, then that's kind of like shit, you know. But if you're going to go to Kibera and photograph something with your own style and to show people through your own lens of how you see Kibera, you know, what you find interesting within Kibera, now that's a dialogue that we can actually sort of like start. And if you are from Mombasa and what you're used to looking at, what your interests in Mombasa are, and what you photograph there, and then looking for that within Kibera, and that relationship, and then all the other cities that you end up going to, or little places that you end up going to, and what is this discussion going to look like, you know, because every photographer is going to have a certain style and a certain way of doing it, and like, one of the things that artists do is residencies. Like, Jackie's been under tons of residencies, right? And you know, the city, like, where you go on residency influences you, but then also you influence that particular scene, and then looking at what's around you, you kind of come up with an idea between that. Because sometimes, you know, people want to copy other photographers so that they can make money, but I think it's more original if you just put in the work to create your own style, so that when you actually do have photos released of, let's say, Lamu or whatever.
Sometimes maybe the intention is not enough. I mean, you can do like have this really interesting dialogue, or like be a really interesting artist, or like the project comes out from something quite interesting and dynamic, and then it's going to be viewed on a very different way. You think it's going to be about something, and then it's going to have a totally different perception.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can't control what other
So you
people
can't-
think about your work
No.
at all. Like, if the people look at Drew Akali, like, they're not going to say, oh, this is definitely about the informal sector in Nairobi and how they use recycled materials to create this reality around them, and this artist is depicting these people as superheroes with this, you know, they're not going to be able to sort of pick it up instantly. But then, you know, it's your job as an artist to make people think about these things, or to make people sort of, this form of escapism, there's also a form of social commentary, there's, you know, sometimes people have bad intentions, straight up.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes people have good intentions, sometimes people are smart, and some people are really stupid. You know, so you can't really control all of it.
I think background, background also has a very big part to play in it, because, you know, for myself, the way I was trained as an artist is that, you know, the artist is always supposed to be like a mirror, to be like a reflection to the environment you're in, reflection to society. But, and that actually encourages the kind of narrative that you're talking about, encouraging the conversation, making people talk about what's going on in the environment, like how you're talking about Kileleshwa, how the landscape is changing and all
It's
that.
changing so much.
Yeah, which is a very interesting story.
It is. Like,
Very interesting, yeah.
I mean, like, I have like, I like coming back to Nairobi after a year and like seeing all these changes. Like, I have a lot of like ideas of what to do with the city in photography.
Yeah.
There's so much to work on here other than just taking tribal photographs.
But you said something interesting. You said if you didn't have the consumer, why would you be photographing?
Exactly.
And that's the starting point.
But why did you pick up the camera itself? The consumer? If you picked up the camera for the consumer, then you should be taking photographs, like commercial photographs, right? If your idea of photography is to make money, then learn your lighting, learn the process, do it perfectly, and get clients to photograph. Invoice them, start a company, employ assistants, and all that kind of. That's photography, like as a business. But photography from a fine art perspective, it's just like, you know, it's, you might not get picked up. It's not really a way to make money in any way, unless you really believe in, you know, the way you look is correct. What needs to be seen.
Who wasn't that?
Oh, you're not talking.
But I liked how you, what you said. No, it's because, I mean, like you talked about Mutua Mateka's work having a purpose, and like that purpose is kind of, oh, I don't want to say like done. I mean, like at the time, I mean, from his, because he was like, I think I think I read on his website somewhere. Like he was tired of seeing photos of Kenya being depicted in a certain way in the Western media. So his response was like a reaction to that. So he would take photos depicting the beauty and how modernized Nairobi has become. Yeah, and now if you look at work like his or similar artists to him, because I feel that a lot of artists kind of also reacted to that. They were like, okay, let's jump on this bandwagon and make Nairobi
HDR images.
Yeah, and make Kenya look a
I
certain way.
think that, Mutua Mutheka did a very good job in terms of depicting the photography, like depicting Nairobi and showing off, we have skyscrapers and this and this and this, and that's great. But like from a very like detached point of view, like everything is from very far away and it's very kind of like whatever. You don't really see the nitty gritties and like the really understanding this dialogue. It's actually, his work is about the city in a very small way, but actually what it is about is digital process. His work is more about digital process and creating images that are generally beautiful through digital process, which is HDR, Photoshop, and so on, and for every digital photographer, you have to use Photoshop. You wanted me to talk about Photoshop, right? So I'm just going to kind of put this with Mutua as well. Like Photoshop is really important because the digital camera, the sensor itself, is not perfect. Like, just like film is not perfect. It's always going to have some color alteration that's incorrect or something that's incorrect or whatever. So actually having raw images from a digital camera is like getting film and not properly kind of like adding the right chemicals and like really treating the film so that the photograph becomes like a true representation of what the world is, what you see. But then the great thing about Photoshop is that you can actually surpass your expectations of what the world will look like and actually create like a completely different reality, which is what Mutua Mutheka has done. He's like actually created Nairobi into a very, very different reality through digital process.
Like what I wanted to touch on specifically, bringing all that together, was how Africans now, what I find very interesting is how Africans are now
like Egyptians.
No, but like for example, us as Kenyans, in the general context, how we're telling not only the Kenyan stories, but like within the African context.
Yeah.
Like now we're talking about not this Norwegian or this American or this British person telling the story about what happened in Libya or what happened in Nigeria, but it's more of the Tanzanian guy telling the story of what happened in Lagos, what happened in Tripoli.
Yeah, we're getting more diverse, which is good.
Yeah. Which I feel like is kind of where we need to go, because it's so much more rich when it's people from the same area telling that story.
But at the same time, I don't think you have more right to tell that story than anyone else. So it's to be careful about that. Because once you believe that you have more right to tell it more than anyone else, you turn the other person into another.
More right.
Which brings me to my question to Tahir, and I guess the other photographers in this room. There's this thing of taking photographs of people, but not saying their names. So, man walking or whatever. Is it wrong, really, to say man walking? You have to go and say, what's your name? So then you write Thomas walking on the street.
Yes.
What's the correct way of doing it? I mean, do you stop everybody and ask them what their names are, or?
It depends. If you're a photographer, sometimes if you're seeing it, that's fine. Yeah, if you're seeing it, I can see he does it. If he shoots at names and if his photos don't seem to be, he wants them to be authentic, don't necessarily have, he wants you to separate that the human aspect from his street photography. He doesn't want you to know your name. But for others, especially people who do documentary, I think it's better if you ask them and then have a backstory for us. My opinion.
Because otherwise we're just repeating what has been done with us by others.
I mean, then also, even if it's, let's say a Kenyan talking about Kenya, right? What's that's the difference with other person coming to take the photograph. So it's not really about maybe an art of the color of their skin or this other person from another country. It's really about the motive of why am I taking this photograph in the first place. So if Msindi takes a picture of me and it was Jackie, and like whatever, he just sees the lighting is perfect and Jackie looks okay with lighting and takes a picture of me, it is not okay because there's something else that he needs to investigate further in order to take the photograph to make it perfect. I think.
Can I just say, I had the same problem in the morning because I was in Kampala a few weeks ago, and this guy in like the most awesome motorbike I'd ever seen. It had like calabashes, it was the shit. And he was driving past, and obviously I couldn't be like, hey, stop, what's your name? So I just took the photo.
Yeah.
And I was looking into something, and Rose, my colleague, was like, oh, you might need permissions if you're going to use this.
For what? What are you using it for?
It was a competition
For?
photos.
For?
African voices.
For?
UCL.
What would the photo be used for if it wins?
Yeah.
Just like printed for fine art purpose?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is around copyright and this is around law, which I will gladly answer your questions.
But it's also about, how I feel about my image going
Yeah,
out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about
There are images, there's an image of you that I use.
Where? Copyright.
Yeah, I mean, so photography, because there are different avenues of photography, so one is commercial, the other is fine art, the other is editorial, the other is documentary, and so on. So for fine art, actually, you don't really need a release form, or you don't need to have the person's permission for fine art purposes. So if somebody takes a photograph of you and uses it for fine art purposes and puts it out in front of the gallery and blah blah blah, then they don't need to have a copyright or the model release form. It's always good to have one if anyone is in fine art or whatever. It's always good to have one because you never know whether that fine art image is going to be used for a commercial purpose. But for commercial purposes, you need the release form because you're using that person's image to sell a product. For editorial as well, you would need, it's a very kind of loose agreement because what is being printed in the paper and how many people are in the photograph and so on and so forth. Like how many times have you signed for a release form when the Star takes a photograph of you?
Zero.
Yeah, and I think that's because they're taking a photo of you. But I personally think there is no right way to deal with this because we can think we are the artist, we are the author, we are the one taking the photo, but we don't need a release form. If you step out of the gate and a person you don't know at all comes up straight in your face with a camera and tries to take a photo, what are you going to do?
Make sure your makeup is good.
Is the lighting?
No, it's true. It's true, but it depends. You have to confront him if you're uncomfortable with it.
Exactly, and as artists we think we have a special permission, which is wrong.
Yeah.
Because if you come to take a photo of me, there'll be a confrontation. I don't care if you have a release form, if you're going to sell it, if it's going to a gallery. Sometimes you just have to have good manners, and that's why Msingi takes photos of it. He's hiding. His subjects don't know that they are being photographed. And ask anybody, and I've spoken to quite a number of photographers, and that's why most photographers find it easy to take photos that are staged, because you bring your model in the space, and you agree. I'll take 100 photos of you within the hour. I know, but sometimes if it's a person you've not had this conversation with, it has a potential to be ugly.
Yeah. But like I said, there are so many people out there with so many different intentions. Some people might have good intentions, some people have bad intentions, and the camera, is just a way for people to sort of, express their intentions.
That's why even Masai in the village, they ask you for money.
because they know, everybody knows. Why are you taking the photo? Eventually you'll make money out of it.
Maybe.
Eventually.
It's all about your approach in doing it. People do it in different ways. I mean, like if you talk about people like Steve McCurry, I mean, they go to Kabul, they go to even here in Nairobi, Spain and India, and all over the place. There's a certain way that he will take a person's image, even though he doesn't know the person, it's the first time, and there's certain ways that you can approach these kind of things without necessarily.
But do you talk to them?
You don't have to.
Well, the fixer has to talk to them. I mean, if it's something like Steve McCurry, then he'll have a fixer that will deal with it if he takes the photograph or whatever. There'll be somebody following him. When he takes the photograph, the fixer will deal with it.
But the thing here is talking to the subject, letting them know that you're going to shoot them. And that's why I asked, if a boy walks up to you, total stranger, camera pointed at you, how are you going to respond? It's not about Makari and that guy, it's about you. How are you going to respond?
I think how you respond to it is because I've been doing this for some time. I mean, watching exactly what you're talking about.
Walking up to people.
And actually, personally, how I do it is that usually I find that when you talk to the person, it interferes with how the outcome of the photo, basically the outcome of the image, when you talk to a person. And there's different ways. I mean, like Tahir, he will, like with the towel heads, or when we did, several
Everything that I do is extremely staged.
I mean, it's staged to an extent, because sometimes when you put a camera, I put a camera to your face right now, like there's that natural element image of this fade away, and it will come back eventually, like once you've gotten used to it. That's one way of doing it, which is what he does. He'll like wait and give you hours and hours, and then he'll come back and take the image. And there's people who will take it like that, which is what you're talking about, how you deal with the reaction. So there's different ways depending on your motive, like what Jack mentioned. It's all about your intent and how you're doing it, what you're trying to say with the image. There's photographers which really just run and take it in the camera right there and then, and they deal with the consequences of it.
Yeah,
which is entire.
But then after you take the photos, you talk to the person. And my question is one, are you taking portraits of people and they don't know about it? And two, do you then, after taking the photo, approach the person and say, I've taken a photo of you? Because, if it's a portrait of me and I see it somewhere around, I'd be like, who the fuck is this guy?
Now that's an ethical
Also,
question.
I think how it's exhibited. A good example I wanted to give is Anela Mutoni. She takes photographs of black lesbians in South Africa, which is problematic because of what the subject matter is about. And her work is basically portraits, and she's exhibited these faces and faces all over the world.
There's a book this big.
Yeah. I have a page between it's 2 years of work, and now it has already grown again. So her approach, she'll come and ask you, and then so ideally it's staged, what you do, but then it's not staged also because it's a whole process, it's a whole investigation of the work that she does, but she has to ask for permission.
Oh yeah, for sure.
She's going to exhibit these portraits, and a lot of these women, their families do not know about their identity, their friends do not know. People are going to get killed. A lot of people who have featured in these portraits have already been murdered. So the idea of you have to ask for permission is very important. As much as the spontaneity, is there. There has to be a very
that you ask
it's
for
ethics.
if the subject is about homosexuality, but if it is a guy carrying calabashes and a motorcycle,
It shouldn't differ. You shouldn't again now look at them as different things. If it's about homosexuality, if it's about somebody walking on the street, ask for permission because it's about that person.
I mean, look at the work of Peter.
Sorry.
So for me, it's normally I don't ask for permission simply because I go for the moment, alright? And the minute you ask somebody, you stop somebody and you ask them for permission, then you lose that moment.
What kind of camera are you using to photograph it?
I use I'm working on user 6D with 85 to
So it's like a DSLR with a mirror.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you want to take photos of people, just like suggestion, like if you want to take candid photos of people, don't use a mirror camera. Just use a straight up mirrorless camera. Because what happens is it's less intrusive.
Okay. So like I was saying, I normally don't ask for permission because sometimes you see a beautiful moment, and once you go and ask for permission, you stop this guy, you get to ruin the moment, and after that you have to stage it, and you miss that.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky subject to talk about. I mean, it's either you sacrifice for a moment of this, or you get a stage photo.
Yeah.
But I don't think you have to sacrifice the moment. I think the nice thing to do would be, if you're taking this photo, after you've taken the photo, approach the guy. You know, at least let him know what's happening, and if he wants the photo deleted, delete it, or, you know, ethically deal with that. Because I think if you're taking...
Ethics versus moment.
This is kind of an ethics thing, and it also kind of goes into law. So just to kind of like sum up this subject about copyright, model releases, and all this kind of stuff, each avenue of photography has a different way of relating to this in terms of the commercialization aspect of it. So how you as a photographer want to deal with your internal demons is like your own situation. But I mean, I think what Wambui kind of like highlighted on as well is knowing the person's name versus not knowing the person's name, which is also an interesting discussion around captioning and how do you caption photos and what it is that says that captioning is used for. You can also, another way of using photography in the medium is captioning and what you're saying in the photo. And also within fine art, I mean, you guys know Damien Hirst at least, and like how his captioning is something that really kind of lifts and opens a discussion of the work itself and, you know, the conceptual side of it. So captioning, as you guys really think about it, is another art form within photo altogether, which is part and parcel with like the written aspect of it. Which my last project displaced was a lot to do with captioning and less to do with the actual photograph.